There's a specific kind of silence that feels wrong. The kind that doesn't belong in your own home, the absence of laughter, of clinking plates, or the shuffle of feet in the next room. It's the kind of silence that wraps around you and whispers, something's not right. That silence hit me like a slap in the face one night when I came home early from a work event. Our house should have been alive with noise, my wife Laura humming in the kitchen, our 2 kids squabbling over which show to watch, but instead, it was eerily quiet. It wasn't just the lack of sound, it was the atmosphere. Heavy, almost suffocating, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I called out, "Laura?" "Kids," but my voice felt swallowed by the stillness. I dropped my keys on the table and wandered through the living room. The kids' shoes were by the door. Her purse was on the counter. Everything was in its place. Everything except my family. I found them in the backyard. Or at least, I found my kids. Danny and Mia were sitting on the old tire swing we'd hung from the maple tree last summer. They weren't playing or laughing, they were just sitting there, staring at the ground like someone had flipped a switch and drained the joy right out of them. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay light. Danny, my 8-year-old, looked up with eyes that felt too old for his face. "Mom said we're supposed to stay out here," he said quietly. "Why?" "She's inside with Mr. Gray," Mia, the younger one, added. Mr. Gray. The neighbor. The guy with the perfect lawn and the $1,000,000 smile. The guy who always just happened to be jogging by when Laura was out gardening. I never thought much of it, just a friendly neighbor being neighborly. But now, hearing his name from my daughter's mouth, something inside me twisted. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my expression calm, though my pulse had started pounding in my ears. "You two stay here. I'll go check on Mom." As I walked back to the house, 1,000 scenarios ran through my mind, each one worse than the last. I reached the patio door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Something expensive, cologne, definitely not mine. And then, the sound, low voices coming from the direction of our bedroom. Our bedroom. I don't remember making a conscious decision to move, but suddenly I was at the door, hand hovering over the handle. I could hear Laura's voice, soft but urgent, and another voice responding, a voice I'd only heard in passing during neighborhood barbecues. I pushed the door open. What I saw in that moment is burned into my brain, as vivid as if it happened seconds ago. I could describe every detail, the way the sheets were rumpled, the look of shock on Laura's face, the way Mr. Gray was scrambling to grab his shirt, but none of it feels real, even now. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Laura said my name, her voice trembling, but I didn't stick around to hear the rest. I turned, walked out, and closed the door behind me. It wasn't until I was back in the yard, sitting between my kids on that tire swing, that I realized my hands were shaking. "Is everything okay?" Mia asked, her little face full of worry. I looked at her, at Danny, at the 2 little lives I'd sworn to protect and realized that nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. I sat there for what felt like forever, staring at the kids while the shock wore off and something darker began bubbling underneath. My hands were still trembling, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was anger. Cold, measured anger. I told the kids to go inside and get ready for bed. Mia hesitated, glancing toward the house like she could sense something bad had happened. I gave her the best smile I could muster, but even I didn't buy it. Once they were inside, I went to the shed. I wasn't thinking clearly, I just needed a moment to breathe, to gather my thoughts. The air inside was damp and smelled like fertilizer, but it was quiet. I paced back and forth, fists clenched, my mind racing through what I'd just seen. What the hell was she thinking? In our house? With our kids outside? And with him, of all people, the guy who'd borrowed my hedge trimmers last summer and never returned them. The sheer disrespect of it was like a slap across the face. I needed answers, but I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not without knowing the full story. I decided to wait. I sat in the living room, pretending to watch TV, while Laura stayed locked in the bedroom. Mr. Gray was long gone by then. I'd heard the front door open and close after a hushed exchange of voices. Eventually, Laura emerged, looking like she'd aged 10 years in an hour. Her hair was a mess, her face pale, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. We need to talk, she said. You think? I replied, keeping my tone calm but sharp enough to make her flinch. Not here. Let's. No, I interrupted. Here's fine. Start talking. She hesitated, then sat down across from me, wringing her hands like a nervous teenager. It's not what you think, she began. That line lit a fire in me. Don't, I said, my voice low. Don't insult my intelligence. Laura blinked, her lips trembling as she tried to form a response. But whatever excuse she'd been rehearsing must have fled her mind. Instead, she broke down, covering her face with her hands. I'm sorry, she choked out. It just happened. It just happened, I repeated, leaning back in my chair. That's all you've got? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Jesus Christ, Laura. With him? She looked up then, her eyes wide with confusion. What does that mean? What does it mean? It means he's the guy who shows up to neighborhood block parties to brag about his new grill. The guy who gets lawn care tips from YouTube tutorials. That's who you're risking our marriage for? I don't know what you want me to say, she whispered. How about the truth? I shot back. Laura took a deep breath, wiping her face. It's been going on for a few months, she admitted. I didn't plan for it, but. You didn't plan for it? I interrupted, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. You don't just trip and fall into someone else's bed, Laura. Her face crumpled again, but I didn't care. I was too angry to feel any sympathy. Do you love him? I asked, my tone deadly serious. No, she said quickly, shaking her head. Then why? I don't know, she whispered. I've just been unhappy. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Unhappy. The same word people use to explain away their midlife crises, their bad decisions, their selfishness. Unhappy, I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Unhappy enough to blow up your family? She didn't respond, just stared at her hands like they held the answers. The conversation didn't go much further. She mumbled something about needing time to think, then disappeared back into the bedroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, replaying the scene over and over in my mind like some cruel movie reel. By the time the sun came up, I had a plan. The next day, I started digging. I'd always been a practical guy, and I wasn't about to go into this blindly. I needed information, texts, emails, phone logs. Anything to help me understand what I was up against. While Laura was out running errands, I got to work. Her phone was locked, of course, but years of sharing devices meant I knew the passcode. What I found made my stomach turn. There were messages going back months. Flirty at first, then explicit. Plans to meet up, jokes at my expense. He'd even been in my house before, apparently while I was at work or running errands. The audacity of it made my blood boil. I went through everything: pictures, call histories, even deleted messages. It was all there, laid out in black and white. Every lie, every betrayal. By the time Laura got home, I had a folder full of evidence. Not because I planned to use it against her, but because I needed to see it all for myself. To make it real. That evening, I called her into the living room. We're talking about this now, I said, holding up the folder. No excuses, no deflections. I want the truth. Laura sat down slowly, her face pale as she eyed the folder. What's that? Proof, I said simply. Now start talking. What followed was an emotional interrogation. Laura tried to explain, to justify, but none of it made any sense. She blamed stress, boredom, even me, at one point. But no excuse could justify what she'd done. By the end of the conversation, we were both drained. I need time to figure this out, I said finally. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll do whatever it takes, she whispered. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the weight of her choices. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care if she was hurting. Because I was too. Laura and I didn't exchange a single word the next day. She left early for work, avoiding eye contact as she grabbed her bag and keys. I stayed back, pretending to sip coffee at the kitchen counter while my mind churned through everything I'd uncovered. When she returned that evening, the kids were upstairs, and I was waiting for her in the living room. The same folder of evidence sat on the coffee table, like a loaded gun between us. I wasn't going to let her weasel out of this. Sit, I said firmly as she walked through the door. She froze, her eyes darting between me and the folder. Can we not do this right now? She asked weakly. No, I said. We're doing this now. Sit down. Reluctantly, she dropped her bag and sat on the edge of the couch. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and she wouldn't meet my gaze. Start talking, I said, leaning forward. I don't know what else you want me to say, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. How about the truth? I shot back. Not some half-baked excuse about being unhappy. I want to know why. Why him? Why now? Why did you throw this family under the bus for some cheap thrill? Her face twisted in frustration. It wasn't like that, she said, her voice rising. You think I just woke up one day and decided to ruin everything? Yes, I snapped. Because that's exactly what you did. And for what? A guy who couldn't keep his lawn alive without you? Her face flushed with anger, but she didn't argue. Instead, she crossed her arms and stared at the floor. Do you love him? I demanded, my voice steady. No, she said quickly. It wasn't about love. Then what was it about? I don't know, she yelled, finally meeting my eyes. Maybe it was about feeling wanted for once. Feeling like someone actually saw me instead of just expecting me to show up and take care of everything. That stung, but I refused to let it show. So this is my fault now? I didn't say that, she said, her voice quieter now. You didn't have to. I leaned back, crossing my arms. What did you expect to happen, Laura? That you could carry on like this, and I'd just never find out? Or were you planning to leave us for him? Her head snapped up. No. I would never. Don't lie to me, I interrupted. I've seen the messages. The photos. Hell, you were bold enough to bring him into our house, with our kids in the backyard. You tell me, what kind of person does that? Tears spilled down her cheeks, but I felt nothing. Not pity, not sympathy, just a cold, quiet rage. I don't know what you want me to say, she whispered. I want you to admit that you're a liar and a coward, I said, my voice icy. I want you to admit that you didn't care about me, or the kids, or anything else when you were sneaking around with him. That's not true, she yelled, her voice cracking. Isn't it? I shot back. Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn clear. You cared more about him than you did about us. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. But I wasn't done. What happens now? I asked, my tone relentless. Are you going to keep seeing him? Or is this the part where you beg for forgiveness and promise it'll never happen again? She didn't answer, so I pressed on. Do you even want to fix this? Yes, she choked out, looking up at me with red, tear-streaked eyes. Why? I demanded. Because I love you, she said, her voice trembling. I laughed, a cold, humorless sound. You have a funny way of showing it. The conversation dragged on for hours. She kept trying to explain, to justify, but her words only made things worse. She claimed the affair hadn't been physical at first, that it was just emotional, a connection she was missing at home. But that didn't make it any easier to stomach. You had problems? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Newsflash, Laura, every marriage has problems. Adults talk about them. They don't crawl into bed with the neighbor. She winced but didn't argue. Eventually, she broke down completely, sobbing into her hands and begging for another chance. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "Counseling, therapy, I don't care. Just don't throw this away." "Throw it away?" I repeated, incredulous. "I'm not the one who threw it away, Laura. You did that the moment you decided he was worth more than us." "I made a mistake," she pleaded. "But it doesn't have to end this way. We can fix it." "Fix it?" I shook my head. "How do you fix something that's already broken?" Her silence was deafening. By the end of the night, we were both emotionally spent. She went to bed, and I stayed up, staring at the folder of evidence on the coffee table. I didn't know what to do, whether to try and salvage the marriage for the kid's sake or walk away and let the pieces fall where they may. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. And I wasn't sure I even wanted it to be. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Laura moving around in the kitchen. For a split second, everything felt normal, like it was any other day. But then reality came rushing back, and I felt that familiar knot in my stomach tighten. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, before finally forcing myself out of bed. I didn't have a plan yet, not really. All I knew was that I couldn't let her get away with it, not without consequences. She'd made a mockery of our marriage, of the life we built together, and I wasn't about to roll over and let her sweep it under the rug. Over the next couple of days, I started laying the groundwork. I wasn't impulsive by nature, and I knew that whatever I decided to do had to hit her where it hurt. Emotionally, yes, but more importantly, financially. She'd upended my life, now it was time to dismantle hers. I spent hours on the phone with a lawyer, laying out everything I knew and showing them the evidence I'd collected. Photos, text messages, timelines, it was all there, and it painted a damning picture. My lawyer didn't mince words. If I wanted to, I could bury her in court. The thought brought me some grim satisfaction, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. I decided to bide my time. I needed to make sure every move I made was airtight, every angle covered. Meanwhile, I started making small, deliberate changes around the house. At first, Laura didn't seem to notice. She was too busy walking on eggshells, trying to avoid any more confrontations. But soon enough, the cracks started to show. I canceled our joint credit cards without telling her. One morning, she tried to pay for groceries and had her card declined. She came home furious, waving her phone in my face. "Why is my card not working?" she demanded. "Because it's canceled," I replied calmly. Her eyes widened. "You canceled our credit cards?" "No," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I canceled my credit cards. Yours were just attached to the account." "You can't do that," she snapped. "I can, and I did," I said evenly. "You'll need to get your own card from now on. I suggest you talk to your bank." Her face flushed with anger, but she didn't argue. She knew better. Next, I stopped paying for her car insurance. It was a small thing, but it made a big statement. When she got a notice about her coverage being canceled, she came to me again, this time with a tone that was almost pleading. "Can we talk about this?" she asked. "We already talked," I said. "Remember? You're the one who said you'd do whatever it takes. Consider this part of the cost." She didn't respond, just turned and walked away. I started moving things out of the house, small, personal items she wouldn't notice right away. A few things from my office, some clothes, old photo albums. I wasn't planning to leave just yet, but I wanted to be ready when the time came. And I knew it would come. The turning point came about a week later. I'd been keeping my distance, spending most of my time at work or out of the house. One evening, I came home to find Laura sitting at the dining room table, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen her. She'd clearly been crying, her eyes red and swollen. "I can't do this anymore," she said as soon as I walked in. "Do what?" I asked, setting down my keys. "This," she said, gesturing vaguely at the house. "The tension, the hostility. It's killing me." I didn't respond right away, just stared at her. "And you think it's been easy for me?" I finally asked. No, she admitted, her voice trembling. But we have to figure something out. For the kids, if nothing else. The kids are fine, I said, my tone sharp. They don't need us pretending everything's okay when it's not. So what, then? She asked. You want a divorce? The word hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I didn't answer, not directly. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick envelope. What's that? She asked, eyeing it warily. An agreement, I said, tossing it onto the table in front of her. You sign this, and we'll figure out how to move forward. Until then, nothing changes. She picked up the envelope and started flipping through the pages. Her face went pale as she read. This isn't fair, she stammered. No, I said, my voice cold. It's not. But neither is what you did to me. To us. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. I can't afford this, she whispered. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you started sleeping with the neighbor, I said, my tone razor sharp. Laura didn't say anything after that. She just sat there, staring at the papers in front of her. Finally, she pushed the envelope back across the table. I need time to think, she said. Take all the time you want, I replied, walking away. That night, I started packing in earnest. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Laura had made her choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. This wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It wasn't even about revenge, not really. It was about reclaiming what was left of my dignity, my self-respect. And if that meant burning the bridges we'd spent years building, so be it. By the time I went to bed, I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control. And that, more than anything, was the beginning of my freedom. The house felt like a battlefield in the days following my ultimatum. Laura and I barely spoke, except for the necessary logistics of parenting. We moved through the house like strangers, our paths crossing only when we couldn't avoid it. The tension was suffocating, but I refused to break the silence. If she wanted to talk, it would have to be on my terms, not hers. One evening, after I put the kids to bed, Laura came into the living room and sat down across from me. For the first time in weeks, she looked steady, like she'd come to a decision. We need to talk, she said, her voice firm but not aggressive. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. I'm listening. She hesitated, taking a deep breath before speaking. I've been thinking a lot about everything. What I did. What I've put you through. And I need you to understand how sorry I am. Her words hung in the air, but they didn't land the way she probably hoped they would. I studied her face, searching for something, sincerity, maybe, or a hint of the woman I'd married. But all I saw was guilt, and that wasn't enough. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said finally. I know, she replied quickly. But I don't know what else to say. I can't undo what I did, but I want to make things right. I want to save our marriage. Her voice cracked on the last word, but I didn't flinch. I'd spent too many sleepless nights wondering if there was anything left to save. Now I knew the answer. There's no coming back from this, I said, my tone flat. Her eyes filled with tears, but I kept going. You didn't just betray me, Laura. You betrayed our kids, our life, everything we built together. And for what? Some thrill? Some ego boost? It wasn't like that, she whispered, but I cut her off. Don't tell me what it wasn't, I snapped. I've seen the messages. I know exactly what it was. She looked down at her hands, silent. I let the silence stretch out, forcing her to sit with the weight of her actions. Finally, she spoke. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice small. I want you to take responsibility, I said. I want you to admit that you killed this marriage, not me. And I want you to stop pretending like there's some magical solution that's going to fix everything. Her face crumpled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she nodded, her jaw tightening. You're right, she said quietly. I did this. I broke us. Hearing her say it should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. It felt hollow, like the last breath of a dying thing. "So what now?" she asked. "That depends on you," I replied. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. The papers are ready. You can either sign them, or we can drag this out in court. But one way or another, this is over." Her eyes widened. "You're really going through with this? What did you think?" I shot back. "That I'd just forgive you? Pretend like nothing happened? I thought." "I don't know what I thought," she admitted, shaking her head. "I don't hate you," I said, surprising even myself. "But I can't live like this. I won't." She looked up at me then, her expression unreadable. "Do you still love me?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. Then, slowly, I shook my head. "I love the person you used to be," I said. "The person I thought you were. But I don't know who you are anymore." Her face crumpled, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a pang of sympathy. But it wasn't enough to change my mind. "I'm moving out tomorrow," I said. She stared at me, stunned. "What about the kids?" "I'll be here for them," I said. "Always. But I can't stay in this house. It's not home anymore." She nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping. "I'll sign the papers," she said, her voice barely audible. "Good," I replied. She stood up and walked to the door, pausing for a moment before turning back to face me. "I really am sorry," she said. "I know," I replied. "But sorry doesn't change anything." She nodded again, then walked away. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the empty space where she'd been. I felt drained, like I'd just run a marathon with no finish line in sight. But for the first time in weeks, I also felt a glimmer of something else. Not happiness, exactly, but relief. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I was done looking back. The next morning, I packed my bags in silence. I moved deliberately, methodically, stuffing clothes into a duffel bag and sorting through the few personal belongings I had decided to take. I avoided the family photos. Those belonged to the past, to a version of my life that no longer existed. Laura stayed out of sight, and I was grateful for it. There wasn't anything left to say. I left the house before the kids woke up. I'd already spoken to them the night before, explaining that I needed to take some time away but reassuring them that I'd still see them regularly. Danny had nodded solemnly, while Mia had clung to me, her small arms wrapped tightly around my neck. "You're coming back, right?" she'd whispered. "Always," I'd told her, though the weight of that promise pressed heavily on my chest. The new apartment wasn't much, just a small, two-bedroom unit on the other side of town, but it was enough for now. I spent the first few days setting it up, filling the space with the bare essentials and trying not to dwell on how empty it felt. The silence here was different from the silence at home. It wasn't oppressive, but it wasn't comforting either. I threw myself into work, grateful for the distraction. The routine helped, as did the steady stream of tasks that kept my mind occupied. But the evenings were harder. That's when the doubts crept in, whispering questions I didn't want to answer. Could I have done more? Should I have stayed for the kids? Was walking away the right choice? One night, about a week after I moved out, Laura called. It was the first time we'd spoken since I left, and hearing her voice felt like reopening an old wound. "I signed the papers," she said, her tone subdued. "Good," I replied. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "How are the kids?" "They're adjusting," I said. "It's hard on them, but they're strong." She sighed, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But when she spoke again, her voice was steady. "I know you hate me," she said. "I don't hate you," I said. "But I can't forgive you either." "I don't expect you to," she said quietly. "But I need you to know. I never meant to hurt you. Or the kids." "I believe you," I said. "But intentions don't matter when the damage is already done." Another silence stretched between us before she finally said goodbye. Over the next few months, I worked on rebuilding my life. I saw the kids regularly, picking them up from school and taking them to my apartment on weekends. We'd watch movies, play board games, and eat pizza on the couch. It wasn't the same as being together as a family, but it was something. I also started going to therapy, something I'd never considered before. At first, I hated it, the vulnerability, the constant self-reflection, but over time, it helped. I began to understand my own role in the breakdown of our marriage, not as an excuse for Laura's actions, but as a way to learn and grow from the experience. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend at the grocery store. We hadn't seen each other in years, and she was surprised to hear about the divorce. "You seem different," she said after we'd talked for a while. "How so?" I asked. "Lighter," she said. "Like you've let go of something heavy." Her words stayed with me long after we parted ways. She was right, in a way. The weight of betrayal was still there, but it didn't define me anymore. Slowly but surely, I was learning to carry it without letting it crush me. Laura and I maintained a civil relationship for the kids' sake, but we were never friends. The trust we once shared was gone, replaced by a polite distance that neither of us tried to bridge. Life went on. The kids grew older, their laughter filling the spaces that had once felt hollow. Work kept me busy, and I even started dating again, though I was cautious about letting anyone get too close. Looking back, I realized that the experience had changed me in ways I hadn't expected. I was more guarded, yes, but I was also stronger. I'd learned that love wasn't always enough to sustain a relationship, that trust was the foundation everything else depended on. And once that foundation was shattered, rebuilding was nearly impossible. I thought about Laura sometimes, wondering if she'd found whatever it was she'd been searching for. But I didn't dwell on it. My life was no longer tied to hers, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. In the end, the divorce wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was the beginning of something new. A chance to start over, to redefine what happiness meant for me. And while it wasn't the life I'd envisioned, it was mine. And that was enough.